The clock struck midnight when David Miller sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the silence broken by a faint vibration on his phone. He pressed play, and a trembling voice whispered, "They know where you are," before the recording ended in static. David Miller's heart pounded as he stumbled toward the window, searching for movement in the street below. The night was deserted, yet the echo of a piercing scream ripped through the silence, freezing him in place. David Miller said, "Who's there?" But no reply came. He ran downstairs and found nothing except a silver locket lying on the wet pavement, engraved with strange symbols that seemed to shift when touched. The night air grew heavier, pressing against his chest as paranoia crept in. He clutched the locket, certain it was left for him, certain that whoever had whispered already controlled the game. David Miller paced his apartment, the locket heavy in his palm as though alive. His thoughts spiraled. The voice had known his location, the scream had lured him out, and the object confirmed he was chosen. David Miller said, "Why me?" his voice cracking. The rain outside had stopped, but the silence felt worse. His reflection in the window looked foreign, eyes hollow with fear. He recalled his late sister wearing a locket, though hers had no strange markings. He whispered, "This can't be hers," but the resemblance was undeniable. His hands shook as he placed it on the table, knowing it wasn't coincidence. The static replayed in his head, and paranoia pressed closer, making him wonder if the game had already begun. The night deepened as David Miller sat at his kitchen table, staring at the locket. His phone buzzed again. This time a text appeared reading, "Move to the next step." His chest tightened as though invisible hands gripped him. David Miller whispered, "What step?" But no answer came. The message deleted itself seconds later, leaving only a blank screen. He slammed the phone down, fear gnawing at his mind. He realized whoever was behind this controlled more than he imagined. Thought made him shiver. He traced the markings again and felt a pulse beneath the surface. His stomach knotted as if the locket itself was alive, urging him to obey. David Miller tried to sleep, but each sound in the apartment seemed magnified. The hum of the fridge was thunder, the creak of the walls a scream. He tossed in bed, locket glinting faintly on the nightstand. A dream seized him. Faceless figures stood in the rain chanting words he couldn't understand. His sister's voice called his name, but when he turned, only shadows answered. He awoke, drenched in sweat, the locket now in his hand, though he swore he left it on the table. David Miller whispered, "No," staring at it as if it had crawled to him. He buried his face in his hands, certain he was losing control. At dawn, David Miller sat by the window, exhausted, eyes ringed with shadows. The city looked normal, but nothing felt safe anymore. His phone buzzed with a single message reading, "Welcome to the game." David Miller whispered, "Game," as chills crawled down his spine. He understood now the locket wasn't a relic but a key. His paranoia sharpened as he noticed a black car idling on the street below. Someone was watching. His pulse quickened, and he shut the blinds with trembling hands. He realized escape was impossible. Whether he wanted to or not, he had already entered the twisted game. David Miller sat rigid at his kitchen table, staring at the locket that gleamed faintly in the morning light. His phone buzzed again with a new message that read, "Follow the path. Do not resist." His stomach clenched as he whispered, "Whose path?" He glanced out the window where the black car remained parked, engine humming faintly. The sense of being watched gnawed at his sanity. David Miller pushed back his chair and muttered, "If this is a game, I won't play by their rules." Yet he knew he had no choice. His hands trembled as he slid the locket into his pocket and grabbed his jacket. The silence of the apartment pressed on him, and each second seemed stretched. As he opened the door, a gust of morning air carried the faintest trace of static, as though the voice from the night before lingered in the very air he breathed. On the street, David Miller felt exposed, his every step magnified by the silence of early dawn. The black car door opened slightly before closing again, as though reminding him he was not free. He whispered to himself, They're controlling even this. The locket weighed heavy in his pocket, its presence unsettling. A text flashed on his phone, "Walk 3 blocks east." His pulse quickened, but his legs carried him forward almost without his consent. The city was waking, but to David Miller it felt staged, as if extras filled the sidewalks. Every face seemed to glance too long. He muttered, "This is all a setup." The air felt charged, heavy with an invisible current. He realized he wasn't only being guided, he was being tested. His hand brushed the locket through fabric, and he swore it pulsed back like a living thing. David Miller reached the corner where an alley split between 2 streets. His phone buzzed with another message, "Choose wisely." He froze, sweat dripping down his back. He said, "What kind of choice is this?" The alley stretched into darkness while the main road glowed under morning light. His breathing quickened as pedestrians passed, unaware of his torment. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Left or right, someone already knows." A flicker of movement caught his eye, and a man in a dark coat stood at the far end of the alley, watching silently. David Miller's chest tightened as their eyes met. A figure gave a faint nod, as if beckoning him. Every instinct screamed to run, yet his feet moved toward the shadows, as though the decision had never been his own. David Miller stepped deeper into the alley, the walls closing in with graffiti and dripping pipes. The man in the dark coat remained motionless, his face obscured by shadow. David Miller said, "Who are you?" But no answer came. The silence pressed harder than words. The locket throbbed faintly in his pocket, as if reacting to the stranger's presence. David Miller's nerves screamed, and yet curiosity pulled him closer. The man finally spoke in a low voice, "The game begins when you admit you're already playing." David Miller's stomach dropped at the words. He whispered, "I never chose this." The man replied calmly, "You never had to." A chill passed through David Miller, as though the alley itself was listening. Each step forward felt irreversible, and he realized trust and danger had become indistinguishable. The man in the coat turned slightly, his features still hidden, and said, "Every piece is moved by a hand you cannot see. You are not the player. You are the piece." David Miller's breath caught, his fists tightening. He said, "Then who moves me?" The man gave no reply, only gestured deeper into the alley. David Miller felt the world tilt, as if his freedom had been peeled away. The locket grew hotter against his chest, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He realized this stranger was not a guide, but a gatekeeper. Fear and defiance battled inside him, but his body moved forward. He muttered, "If this is their game, I'll learn the rules." His steps echoed in the alley, each one binding him further. He understood now he had crossed a line he could never return from. David Miller followed the man in the coat until he reached a hidden doorway beneath a flickering sign. Inside was a dim bar where shadows swallowed the corners. A woman sat alone at the counter, her eyes sharp despite the weary slump of her shoulders. David Miller approached cautiously. The man in the coat whispered, "Emily Harris knows more than she admits." Then he vanished into the dark. Emily Harris glanced up, her voice steady yet tired. She said, "You shouldn't have come here." David Miller froze, sensing her fear disguised as indifference. He muttered, "I didn't have a choice." Emily Harris sighed, staring into her glass as though secrets swam within. The room seemed alive with listening walls, and David Miller realized he had just stepped into another trap disguised as refuge. Emily Harris leaned closer, her voice a whisper barely audible above the hum of neon. She said, "They're watching you, every step, every word. The locket isn't just a key, is a chain." David Miller's chest tightened as he asked, "Then why tell me?" Emily Harris stared at him, her expression torn between caution and pity. She murmured, "Because I know what happens when you resist." Her eyes flicked toward a scar across her wrist, half hidden under her sleeve. David Miller followed her gaze, unease rising. He whispered, "You were part of this." Emily Harris did not answer, but the silence said enough. She downed her drink in one swallow, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time, David Miller saw not only fear but guilt etched in her face. Before David Miller could press further, a man slipped into the bar, his movements careful yet deliberate. Marcus Reed, tall and rugged with graying stubble, scanned the room before approaching. David Miller tensed, but Emily Harris muttered, "Hes not with them. Not exactly." Marcus Reed sat opposite, his voice low and edged. He said, "If you want to survive, you'll need me. I know how their game works." David Miller studied him, suspicious. He asked, "Why help me?" Marcus Reed smirked bitterly and replied, "Because I hate them more than you do." Emily Harris's eyes darted between them, unease written in every line of her face. David Miller realized the room now held two people with knowledge of the game, but neither could be trusted fully. Marcus Reed leaned closer, his voice steady but urgent. He said, "They test you with choices, but every path leads to the same place. What matters is how long you last." David Miller frowned and whispered, "You talk like you've played before." Marcus Reed gave a dry laugh. "I lost everything because of them. That's why I know." Emily Harris shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on her empty glass. David Miller asked, "Why keep me alive then?" Marcus Reed smirked. "Because you're not meant to win. You're meant to reveal." Emily Harris finally spoke. "Stop. He doesn't need to know that." Her voice cracked, revealing dread she could no longer hide. The air between them thickened with unspoken truths, and David Miller felt like a pawn seated at a rigged table. The bar door creaked open, and a uniformed officer entered, scanning the room with deliberate slowness. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his badge glinting faintly under neon. David Miller tensed, his instincts warning him that this man was no savior. Emily Harris whispered, "Don't trust him." Sheriff Daniel Brooks said, "Mr. Miller, you've stirred up trouble you don't understand." His tone carried authority laced with something darker. Marcus Reed muttered under his breath, "Here comes the broken law." David Miller's pulse raced and he asked, "Are you here to protect me or deliver me?" Sheriff Daniel Brooks gave a thin smile and replied, "That depends on how well you play." The words echoed with menace, confirming David Miller's fears that even authority was compromised. The air in the bar grew suffocating as Sheriff Daniel Brooks circled the group like a predator. David Miller sat rigid, his hand brushing the locket in his pocket as if for protection. Emily Harris whispered, "He's not here to save you." Marcus Reed muttered, "He's part of the rot." Sheriff Daniel Brooks stopped, his sharp gaze fixed on David Miller. He said, "The game's master has chosen you for a reason, and it isn't survival." David Miller's voice cracked as he asked, "Then what am I supposed to be?" The sheriff's thin smile revealed nothing but menace. Emily Harris shifted uneasily, and Marcus Reed's jaw clenched in anger. David Miller realized then that the figure of authority before him was another piece of the trap, one wearing the mask of law. Sheriff Daniel Brooks leaned closer to David Miller, lowering his voice to a growl. He said, "Pieces are sacrificed to reveal the board." David Miller whispered, "You're working for them." Emily Harris's fists tightened on the bar, her knuckles white. She hissed, "He's been theirs for years." Marcus Reed slammed his fist on the table, rattling glasses. He said, "You ruined lives, Brooks." Sheriff Daniel Brooks gave a calm smile and replied, "I preserved order, just not the kind you believe in." David Miller felt his chest tighten as the locket pulsed in his pocket, heating with each word. He realized the sheriff was not a protector, but a servant to the same invisible hands moving every piece on the board. The bar door creaked again, and silence fell. A new figure entered, tall and composed, dressed in a black suit. Jonathan Crane, his expression calm and voice smooth, stepped forward. Emily Harris muttered under her breath, "The one pulling strings." David Miller's throat went dry. Jonathan Crane said, "Every player searches for control, yet none truly hold it." His tone was soothing, but menace laced every word. Marcus Reed spat, "You're the master of this circus." Jonathan Crane smiled faintly. Not master. Conductor. You all play your notes, and I conduct the symphony. David Miller's heart hammered as he realized the man before him was not a stranger. He knew Jonathan Crane from years past, a connection buried deep in memory. Jonathan Crane walked slowly toward the table, his polished shoes echoing across the floor. David Miller's breath hitched as memories surfaced, his sister's funeral years ago, and Jonathan Crane standing in the crowd unnoticed. Emily Harris whispered, "He's always been here." Jonathan Crane said softly, "The locket is not yours to keep. It binds, it reveals, it destroys." Marcus Reed leaned forward and growled, "You killed my brother for this game." Jonathan Crane tilted his head, expression unreadable. He replied, "Your brother chose poorly." Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood rigid, eyes cold, clearly in Crane's service. David Miller clenched his fists, realizing the villain had woven himself through every strand of his life, long before this night began. Jonathan Crane leaned close to David Miller, his voice calm but suffocating. He said, "You think this started last night? You've been playing since the day you were born." David Miller's face went pale as Emily Harris grabbed his arm, whispering, "Don't listen." Marcus Reed slammed his palm on the table, roaring, "You twisted everything." Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood silent, a sentinel of corruption. Jonathan Crane smirked and said, "The difference between a player and a pawn is acceptance." David Miller whispered, "Then I'll never accept it." Crane's smile deepened as he replied, "You already have." The words sank into David Miller like poison. He realized his entire life had been a carefully orchestrated move in a game he never chose. The tension in the bar shattered when Jonathan Crane clapped his hands once, the sound echoing like a gavel. The neon flickered violently, and a new message appeared on David Miller's phone. "A piece must fall." Emily Harris's face paled as she whispered, "Not again." Marcus Reed growled, "I won't let you take another." Sheriff Daniel Brooks remained silent, his cold stare fixed on the group. David Miller's chest constricted as he muttered, "Who decides?" Jonathan Crane smiled faintly and said, "The game does." The locket in David Miller's pocket pulsed hot, searing his skin. Emily Harris trembled, her hand brushing the scar on her wrist, as though she knew exactly what was coming. The lights dimmed, leaving only the flicker of neon across their faces. Jonathan Crane's voice carried like a sermon. He said, "Sacrifice is not cruelty. It is structure." Emily Harris gasped, shaking her head. She said, "Don't do this to him." David Miller looked at her in shock. "Him?" he whispered. Marcus Reed slammed his fist again and roared, "Try me, Crane." Jonathan Crane's eyes narrowed with amusement. He replied, "Your courage makes you useful. Sacrifice must be chosen elsewhere." David Miller's phone buzzed once more, the message reading, "The weakest link." His pulse raced as he turned toward Emily Harris, who looked away, guilt written across her trembling face. David Miller's voice cracked as he said, "No, not her." Emily Harris shook her head and whispered, "It was always going to be me." Marcus Reed stood, defiance burning in his eyes, but Jonathan Crane raised a single hand, and the room fell still. The sheriff's hand drifted to his holster, a silent warning. Emily Harris looked at David Miller, her expression both tender and broken. She said softly, "I'm sorry you were dragged into this." Tears welled in David Miller's eyes as he reached for her hand, but the locket pulsed violently, burning against his chest. Jonathan Crane said, "The piece has chosen." David Miller screamed, "No!" but his voice dissolved into the shadows. In one swift moment, the neon lights flared white, and a gunshot thundered through the bar. Emily Harris collapsed against the counter, her eyes wide in shock before fading. David Miller caught her as she fell, screaming her name. Marcus Reed shouted, "Damn you, Crane!" But Jonathan Crane only watched, his calm smile unbroken. Sheriff Daniel Brooks lowered his smoking gun, expression cold and detached. David Miller shook Emily Harris desperately, whispering, "Stay with me." Her lips parted weakly as she said, "Don't trust anyone." before going still. The silence after was unbearable, broken only by David Miller's ragged sobs. David Miller's tears blurred his vision as he cradled Emily Harris's body. Jonathan Crane stepped closer, his tone smooth as silk. He said, "This is the price of progress." David Miller looked up, rage burning through his grief. He growled, "I'll end this game." Marcus Reed placed a steady hand on David Miller's shoulder and said, "Not alone." Sheriff Daniel Brooks holstered his weapon, muttering, "You're not ready to understand." Jonathan Crane smiled coldly and said, "The game is only beginning." David Miller clenched the locket so tightly it cut into his palm, blood mingling with metal. He whispered, "You'll regret this." The promise carried through the suffocating silence, a spark of defiance in the heart of despair. David Miller staggered from the bar into the cold night, Emily Harris's last words echoing in his mind. The rain had returned, slicking the streets with silver. Marcus Reed walked beside him, jaw set, rage carved into his face. Jonathan Crane followed slowly, his black suit untouched by the storm. Sheriff Daniel Brooks shadowed them, eyes scanning like a hunter. David Miller muttered, "This ends tonight." Marcus Reed grunted, "Then we bleed for it." Jonathan Crane's calm voice carried through the storm. "The board is almost full." David Miller felt the locket burning in his palm, its heat unbearable. He realized it no longer represented a key, but a weapon. The rain masked his tears, but his fury burned brighter than the storm. They moved into an abandoned warehouse, its cavernous interior lit by flickering lamps. David Miller's breath echoed against the steel beams. Jonathan Crane walked ahead with deliberate calm. Sheriff Daniel Brooks closed the doors with a metallic clang, sealing them inside. Marcus Reed whispered, "This is where they break us." David Miller spat, "No, this is where we break them." Jonathan Crane turned with a faint smile. "You speak as though you still control your destiny." David Miller lifted the locket, the metal glowing faint red. "Maybe I do." Crane's eyes flickered with interest. Sheriff Daniel Brooks drew closer, hand resting near his weapon. Marcus Reed positioned himself at David Miller's side, ready for the storm. Jonathan Crane's voice reverberated through the warehouse. "You think the locket answers to you, it answers to the board." David Miller shouted, "Then let it answer to me tonight." He slammed the locket against the steel table, and a wave of static surged through the air. Lights flickered violently as sparks erupted from exposed wires. Marcus Reed staggered back, shielding his face. Sheriff Daniel Brooks steadied himself, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Jonathan Crane remained unmoved, though his calm mask faltered for a heartbeat. David Miller's chest heaved as he said, "I'm not your pawn." Crane whispered, almost amused, "No, you are the queen." The words rattled David Miller, a revelation twisting the game into a deeper nightmare. David Miller's breath shook as he stared at the locket pulsing with violent energy. Marcus Reed muttered, "He's changing the rules." Jonathan Crane's voice dropped to a whisper. "Every queen must sacrifice her kingdom to win." David Miller shouted, "I'll sacrifice nothing but you." Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped forward, weapon half drawn. He said, "You don't understand, Miller. You're more dangerous than he is." David Miller's fury broke loose. He lunged, slamming Brooks against a pillar. The sheriff's gun clattered to the floor, echoing across the vast chamber. Marcus Reed rushed in to hold David back, shouting, "Don't lose yourself." Jonathan Crane watched with cold fascination, hands folded, as though the chaos was his masterpiece. David Miller stood over Sheriff Daniel Brooks, chest heaving, fists clenched. Brooks coughed and muttered, "You're not the savior. You're the weapon." Jonathan Crane stepped forward, his calm smile cutting through the noise. He said, "Now you see, David, this game was never about choice. It was about awakening." Marcus Reed growled, "You're twisting him." David Miller's eyes burned with rage and despair. He whispered, "If I'm the weapon, then I'll destroy the board." He raised the locket high, its glow blazing brighter, filling the warehouse with crimson light. Crane's eyes gleamed with approval, not fear. "Yes," he whispered. "Now you understand." David Miller realized in horror that every act of defiance had been part of Crane's design. The warehouse trembled with the crimson glow of the locket as David Miller held it high, his face twisted in fury and despair. Marcus Reed shouted, "You'll tear everything apart." Sheriff Daniel Brooks struggled to his feet, coughing but smirking. He muttered, "That's exactly what Crane wants." Jonathan Crane stepped closer, his calm voice carrying through the chaos. He said, "The Queen doesn't flee the board, David, she dominates it." David Miller's chest heaved as he whispered, "I'm not your queen." The locket pulsed violently, sending ripples of static across the steel walls. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and David Miller realized the choice wasn't survival but destruction. His fate was no longer escape but revelation. David Miller's hands shook as the locket's glow intensified, filling the warehouse with unbearable heat. Marcus Reed cried, "You'll kill us all." Jonathan Crane raised his arms as if embracing the chaos. He said, "And from the ashes, the real game begins." Sheriff Daniel Brooks barked, "Control it, Miller, before it consumes you." David Miller's voice broke. "I never wanted this." The locket's hum turned into a piercing shriek, rattling beams overhead. David Miller fell to his knees, clutching it as blood trickled from his palm. His tears mixed with rain dripping through the cracked ceiling. He whispered, "If I can't win, I'll end it." The air thickened, vibrating with violent energy, as the warehouse began to crumble around them. Steel beams groaned as sparks rained, the warehouse collapsing in chaos. David Miller screamed, "No more games." The locket erupted with blinding light, throwing Marcus Reed backward. Sheriff Daniel Brooks shielded his eyes, shouting, "He's tearing the board apart." Jonathan Crane, however, stood motionless, his eyes glimmering with satisfaction. He whispered, "Yes, David, burn it." David Miller's body convulsed as the energy surged through him, searing his veins with fire. Marcus Reed crawled toward him, yelling, "Don't let him win." David Miller's face contorted between agony and defiance. He realized Crane had never wanted control. He had wanted David to unleash destruction willingly. David Miller forced himself upright, veins glowing faintly red from the locket's energy. He said, "If I'm the weapon, then I'll choose where it ends." Marcus Reed shook his head, yelling, "Don't do it." Sheriff Daniel Brooks snarled, "Hell, bring the city down." Jonathan Crane's calm voice cut through the storm. He said, "And still, it is beautiful." David Miller looked at Marcus Reed with sorrow in his eyes and whispered, "Tell them I fought." He raised the locket high, its glow blazing into a fiery storm. The ground split beneath them, and an explosion of light engulfed the warehouse. For a brief second everything froze, then silence swallowed the world. When the light faded, the warehouse was gone, reduced to twisted steel and smoking rubble. Marcus Reed coughed, dragging himself from the wreckage, searching desperately. Sheriff Daniel Brooks limped away, his uniform torn, muttering, "The board still stands." Jonathan Crane emerged untouched, his suit immaculate, his calm smile intact. He whispered, "And the Queen has been crowned." David Miller was nowhere to be seen. Only the locket remained, half buried in ash, faintly glowing with life. Marcus Reed collapsed to his knees, whispering, "David?" Jonathan Crane turned to the shadows, already walking away. The silence was suffocating, leaving one truth clear: this game was not over. It had only just begun.